Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Morning, Leith. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
Nice to meet you. Can I just preface this by saying, speak to me as though you're speaking to a Labrador, because I really don't know much about economics. All I know is that I haven't got any money, and I'm hoping that things are going to get better.
Yeah, unfortunately, mate, I think most Australians are probably thinking the same way at the moment, and for good reason. So on Wednesday, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is our statistical agency, our central statistical agency, released the fourth quarter national accounts. Right. So what those are basically the broad accounts on the Australian economy, which tells us how much the economy grew, where it grew, all those sorts of things. And what it showed is that the economy has finally emerged from the longest per capita recession in modern history. So what a per capita recession is, it's basically when the population grows faster than the economy grows. And what it means is that everybody's share of the economic pie shrinks. And effectively what had happened to Australia is we've until this quarter, we'd had 7 consecutive quarters of our real per capita GDP. So this is basically our share of the economy shrinking.
Right.
And actually 8 of the last 9 quarters it had shrunk. So 7 in a row and 8 of the last 9. And finally, we actually got a little bit of growth. So the overall Australian economy grew by 0.6% in the December quarter, and it was up 1.3% year on year. And what that meant is once you subtract the 0.5% of population growth that we got in the December quarter, it meant that per capita, our slice of the economic pie grew by, wait for it, drum roll, 0.1%.
0.1 is better than minus 0.1. But what do we attribute that to, Leith?
Yeah, so the reason for it is we actually got we've had record government spending, which is driving the economy at the moment. So, you know, a lot of this is coming through the massive infrastructure building by federal and state governments, as well as spending on the NDIS and all those sorts of things. And in the last year, public spending has contributed 1.5% to Australia's GDP growth of 1.3%. So, in fact, the economy has been driven by government spending. But this didn't stop our illustrious Treasurer Jim Chalmers boasting that the result yesterday was the, quote, beginnings of a private sector-led recovery, which is not true because government spending is driving it.
Right.
And he also said that incomes are strengthening, which is also not true because the little fly in the ointment here, Phil, which is the thing that, you know, we all care about, is that Australian households continue to go backwards. So government spending is driving the economy's growth, but actual household consumption, once you adjust for inflation and population growth, our per capita, per person consumption on goods and services and those sorts of things has actually declined for 8 consecutive quarters, and it fell again in the December quarter.
Right.
So although the overall economy grew marginally in per person terms, actual household consumption continues to fall. And the annoying thing about this is that the share of our consumption that's been spent on essentials rather than discretionary goods, so this is stuff that we have to buy, you know, whether that's energy or whatever, and food, rather than things we'd like to buy, like, you know, holidays and, you know, discretionary stuff.
Yeah.
Our spending on essentials has risen to a historically high level of nearly 60%.
Wow.
And that's a lot higher than it typically is. And the worst fly in the ointment here, Phil, is that Australian households have experienced one of the largest declines in our real disposable incomes in the developed world.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me. I was going to say before as well, it's great news on behalf of the government to give us this, you know, improvement just in time for an election too.
Yeah, it is. But unfortunately, the boots on the ground feeling, if you're an Australian household, which is everyone listening to this, like the household sector, the economy split up into basically government, households and business sectors. And the sector that's the largest and the most important, obviously, to everybody listening to this is the household sector, because that's the sector that we live in, right? Yeah. That sector is still getting squeezed. So our consumption's falling, continues to fall once you adjust for inflation and population growth. So our per-person consumption's falling, but also our per-person incomes after inflation are declining as well. We've already had the biggest decline in the advanced world over the last couple of years, and they continued to fall in the December quarter. So our real per-person spending actually fell by another 0.1%. It's down by about 8% from when the government took office. And this has been driven by a whole bunch of things, but part of it is we've had, obviously, the interest rate rises, etc., which has sucked out income into things like mortgage payments. We've also had a big rise in average tax rates as well through bracket creep and things like that. So that's also sucked out our disposable income. And, the end result is that while it's encouraging that the economy's, 2-year almost per capita recession is officially over, and we had a tiny bit of growth per person, the recession remains for Australian households because we continue to get squeezed. And it's only because of this record government spending that the economy really, has been growing in the private sector, and in particular Australian households remain stuck firmly in recession.
Yeah, and I understand the concept of bracket creep as well, and the fact that, like you say, households now can no longer afford things that are necessary, essential items like food.
Yeah, absolutely. Food, energy, all these sorts of things are the things that we're getting squeezed on. And the sad reality is that Australia's incomes have not kept up with the rising cost of living, and they haven't for several years. And that's the reason why Australians have experienced the largest decline in household disposable incomes per person.
And I guess a lot of people would be afraid, Leith, I was going to say, a lot of people would be afraid to go and ask for a pay rise because we're all now in a situation where we're grateful to have a job.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, and also, to be fair, if a lot of companies just can't afford it at the moment. So but the area that's driving most of the employment growth, so over 80% of Australia's employment growth at the moment is coming from things that it's called government-aligned sectors. So what that means is that's basically sectors of the economy. It's not necessarily public servants, but it's areas of the economy that are at least funded by government, and a lot of that's related to the NDIS. And if the actual private sector side of the economy, which isn't reliant on any government funding, and whether it's a cafe or another type of business, they're all getting squeezed, and they are effectively in recession. So it's only this record government spending which just to put it into perspective, the government spending share of the economy hit a record high 29% in the December quarter, and that compares to a historical average of just under 24%. So, and it's risen a lot in the last several years, and a lot of that's related to NDIS spending. So, the government spends about $40 billion a year currently on the NDIS, so it's actually getting close to $50 billion now. And it's risen enormously, and that's basically, powered the economy, and it's powered a lot of the job growth. But if you're outside of that, which is most of us, and you work in the private sector, you're actually getting pretty squeezed.
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate reality of the Australian economy here. We've exited the per capita recession, which is the longest in recorded history at 7 quarters in a row. But the recession for households remains, and our spending, and more importantly, our incomes continued to fall in the fourth quarter.
That's right. And of course, with excess spending, eventually, you're going to have to pay the ferryman. Eventually, it's going to come across, and you're going to have to pay that bill. Yeah,
that's right. Unfortunately, it's the economy can only live off the government paycheck. I guess taxpayers off the taxpayer teeth for so long, and we basically need the private sector economy to take over and start powering the growth. But for several years, the economy's been reliant on this, tax and spend by the government, NDIS, infrastructure spending, all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And it's the private sector side of the economy that is really struggling and continues to struggle.
Where can we go to get more information?
Yeah, so anybody wants to read about this sort of stuff, I write about daily on macrobusiness.com.au. I write about this issue, about these sorts of issues, all economic type issues, policy issues, housing, a lot about housing, energy, all the sort of nuts and bolts stuff that Australian citizens should care about.
Yeah, well, people like me, you're absolutely right. And that's why I'll be contacting you too to find out more info as we go along. Thank you so much, Leith. Have a terrific day today.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Speak to you next time.
In 5